When people ask me what I miss most about living in Europe, I always say the same thing. I miss the food. And I don't even mean any specific type of food. It's the feeling that I get when I go to the grocery store. The feeling that I miss specifically is the sense of knowing what you see is also what you get. Let me give you a quick example. When I go to the grocery store in Germany to buy a bottle of Heinz ketchup, here's the ingredient list. Tomatoes, distilled vinegar, sugar, salt, herbal and spice extract, and spice. Now, if I want to go to an American grocery store to buy the exact same bottle of Heinz ketchup, here are the ingredients. Tomato concentrate, distilled vinegar, high fructose corn syrup, salt, spice, onion powder, and natural flavoring. Because the question I've been asking myself for a really long time is, why do a lot of American products in American grocery stores not only have different ingredients, but ingredients that are less healthy and more processed compared to the exact same product that is being sold in European grocery stores? Also, disclaimer, I just want to make it very clear that this video is not at all to shame anyone's eating habits or preferences. We're going to explore this topic of American food and the American food industry from a historical and political and economic perspective, and this has absolutely nothing to do with what your favorite food or drink is, and I'm not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't eat. So now, without further ado, let's get into the video. Hi there, my name is Indra. I'm originally from Germany, and about 2 years ago, I moved to the US, where I now live with my American husband, Chandler. Now let's actually take a look at some of the fundamental differences between the American food industry and the European food industry. When it comes to food additives, the European Union regulates those way more heavily than the American food industry does. On average, a processed product in the US contains around 3.1 additives, while a similar product in the European Union only contains around 1.9 additives on average. And in the US, between 50 to 60% of daily calories actually come from highly processed foods, while that number is only between 25 to 30% in Europe. The US also relies a lot more heavily on added sweeteners like high fructose corn syrup, for example, which means that a lot of processed dessert products in the US also contain more sugar than a similar product would in Europe. The approval process for ingredients is also different in the European Union compared to the US, because the European Union requires a lot more extensive testing until a product can even be considered safe, and it requires formal approval from the European Food Safety Administration. In the US, however, companies can actually classify their own ingredients as safe, and sometimes they don't even need to seek pre-approval from the Food and Drug Administration. So, not to be dramatic, but basically a company can be like, we tested this ingredient is safe to use, and America is gonna say, go off. When it comes to ingredient transparency, there is also a difference in how the European Union handles that versus the US. So when you go to a grocery store in the EU and you read something like natural flavor, that is actually a legal term. So natural flavor, per definition, not only means that the source of this ingredient has to be natural, so like a plant or an animal, for example, but that it also has to contain 95% of that actual ingredient. So if you're reading natural strawberry flavor, 95% of that ingredient actually has to be strawberry. In the US, however, companies can use that exact same term, like Heinz ketchup, for example, but food companies in the US actually don't have to tell you where the ingredient comes from, and there's also no rule for how much of this ingredient actually has to contain that natural source. So that's what I mean when I say shopping in US grocery stores doesn't always mean that what you see is necessarily what you get, because labeling is less transparent. Food companies can also use a lot more additives that simply wouldn't be allowed in the European Union. There are more processed foods to choose from, and it's also easier for the food companies to add ingredients to their products and call them safe. Now, to understand how we got to this point today, that the rules and regulations in the US are so different, we need to go back in time a little bit. In fact, we need to go back all the way to the 70s. In the beginning of the 1970s, the US experienced a pretty significant grain shortage, and that was kind of one of the first dominoes to fall in this development of the American food industry as we know it today. The first chapter is called The Birth of the Monoculture. Because before the US experienced that grain shortage, farming and agriculture was actually very similar in Europe and in the US. Farmers were incentivized and paid not to overproduce. Farmers had stricter regulations and had to keep some of their land unplanted to avoid overproduction. The government would also store grain to keep prices and supply stable. And everything in the system was really optimized to just keep a stable supply. And that's basically the system that's still in place in Europe today. But Europe around that same time also didn't experience that same grain shortage as the US, which led to the system fundamentally changing. So to combat that food inflation crisis in the 70s, the Secretary of Agriculture at that time, Earl Butz, actually rewrote the Farm Bill. And this is where the agricultural system in the US fundamentally started changing and went in a way different direction compared to the European system. Because to fight inflation, what Butz did is basically remove all of the rules and regulations that were in place to keep supply stable. And what that new Farm Bill did was incentivize huge farms, remove the acreage restrictions. The federal crop insurance was also favoring farms that were just planting uniform crops. So the Farm Bill really incentivized farmers to plant as much as they could of the same crop. So that way the market could be flooded with all of these cheap ingredients that all the food companies could use to make processed foods and ultimately combat inflation. And there's one crop in particular that massively benefited from those changes in the early 70s, and that's corn. Because on the one hand, corn is a very easy crop to grow in many regions of the US, specifically the Midwest, which is also one of the most productive agricultural areas in the world. But corn is actually also incredibly versatile. Corn can turn into high fructose corn syrup, maltodextrin, modified starch, corn oil, ethanol, citric acid, ascorbic acid, binding material for pills, animal feed, and even packaging materials. And this is where we enter chapter 2, the high fructose corn syrup revolution. Another difference between American and European agriculture is that while corn grows very, very well in the US, many countries in Europe actually have excellent conditions to grow sugar beets. And sugar has always been historically expensive in the US, especially because apparently the sugar lobby is also really strong. So then when corn entered the chat in the 70s, it became apparent that this was a way cheaper alternative to use as a sweetener compared to sugar. So by the time the 80s rolled around, a lot of big companies like Coca-Cola and Pepsi, for example, switched from using real sugar in their sodas to using high fructose corn syrup because it was just so incredibly cheap because of the constant overproduction of corn in the US. And to protect the local sugar industry in Europe, Europe has actually capped and heavily regulated the use of high fructose corn syrup in all products. Now, here's the thing. From my understanding, and from the research that I did, it looks like consuming the same amount of sugar versus the same amount of high fructose corn syrup only has a minimally different impact on your health. However, because high fructose corn syrup is so cheap and it's very, very versatile, a lot of companies started adding it to all of their products that you wouldn't expect it to be in, which means that people are consuming high fructose corn syrup a lot more on a daily basis without actually knowing it. Just to give a few examples, a lot of the commercial bread that you can buy in the US often contains high fructose corn syrup just because it helps with shelf life and texture. You can find it in a lot of sauces and salad dressings or Heinz ketchup. It also helps with keeping the flavor and consistency of a lot of canned soups. And high fructose corn syrup is just one of many examples of ingredients that I sometimes feel like when I go to an American grocery store, I'm being deceived a little bit because I would never expect a lot of these products to be so incredibly sweet and sweetened. This isn't a thing that matters as much in isolation. But when you think about all of the different products that contain high fructose corn syrup that you might eat on a regular basis, you probably end up consuming a lot more sugar than you are aware of. Let's move on to the next chapter. This chapter is called the Deregulation Era. And yes, I spelled deregulation like that intentionally. So we already looked at the more economic perspective of the food inflation crisis and everything that happened as a result of that. Now let's take a look at some of the political changes that happened around that time. Because in 1981, America had a new president, Ronald Reagan. I mostly knew him as this charming, funny guy that was an actor before he became the president of the United States. I guess kind of the blueprint of, someone on TV then becoming an American president.
What the hell, let's move on to something else.
Politically, he's also known for something else, and that is deregulation. That man deregulated a lot of things, whether it's the energy sector, media and communications, banking and finance, transportation, and also the food industry. Early in his presidency, Reagan defunded and deregulated the FDA, which is the American Food and Drug Administration. And here's what the FDA is supposed to do. The Food and Drug Administration, short FDA, is a U.S. federal agency responsible for protecting public health by ensuring the safety and security of human and veterinary drugs, biological products, medical devices, the nation's food supply, cosmetics, and radiation-emitting products. I guess in other words, the FDA is supposed to keep people safe and somewhat healthy. I think that's a fair assessment to make. Unfortunately, though, in the early 80s, the FDA's budget was cut and its staff was reduced by 11%. After those cuts, the FDA had less food inspectors, ultimately less enforcement, and also more self-regulation. Something interesting started to happen. A few decades earlier, in 1958, the Eisenhower administration actually introduced something that was called the Food Additives Amendment. And this amendment includes a clause that states that historically safe and proven additives no longer need to be subjected to pre-market approval, because these additives were generally recognized as safe. Now, originally, this clause was only intended to apply to things like salt or vinegar, for example. And that actually worked well for a long time, and it eliminated the need to test certain ingredients that were simply known to be incredibly safe to use in food. But when the 80s came along and the FDA was facing so many budget cuts and staff cuts, this clause started to become a bit of a loophole. Because per this clause, companies could simply self-declare new ingredients and new additives as generally recognized as safe. And over time, this has turned the American food industry into one of the most deregulated ones. And because the US also never required the same amount of ingredient transparency as the European Union, for example, a lot more potentially harmful ingredients could also enter the American market more easily and without much oversight. The question that still remains, I think, is, well, does this mean you can't actually eat healthy in the US? Personally, from my experience having lived here for 2 years now, I would say that no, that doesn't mean you can't eat and live healthy in the US. You can find pretty much everything in the grocery store, from incredibly healthy, organic, local producer products, all the way to some of the most high processed foods that I've ever seen in my entire life. And the biggest difference that I personally notice in American versus European grocery stores is that European grocery stores often have less of a range. So they will have just as many healthy products, but when it comes to the incredibly unhealthy stuff, they simply have less of that. Yes, I do feel like American grocery stores make it harder for you to truly find products that are actually healthy and don't have any hidden ingredients like high fructose corn syrup or hidden additives or loose terms like natural flavor that can mean a lot of different things. So overall, I would say that if your goal is to eat healthy in the US, you simply have to pay more attention to what you're buying at the grocery store. And for me, that meant doing some of my own research and really understanding what different labels and different ingredients actually mean that might have a different description or a more obvious description in German grocery stores, finding specific brands that operate under different and stricter standards, and overall sticking to mostly, eating whole foods or minimally processed foods. Another thing I do is use one of those apps that you can use to scan the QR code of a certain product, and it gives you a list of the ingredients and it kind of ranks them based on how good they are or how bad they are. The one that I use is called Yuka. I'll put it up here. It's not sponsored. Even though if you want to sponsor me, let me know. But that's just something that I use when I'm not fully clear what maybe certain ingredients mean, and just seeing it spelled out for you and seeing that, oh, this product just contains a lot of ingredients that aren't good for you. That also usually incentivizes me to find a better alternative. And even though I feel like this was a lot of information, I still feel like we kind of only scratched the surface. I didn't even touch on grocery prices and how much it actually costs to live healthy and eat healthy in the US. If you're interested in that, let me know. I'm happy to break that down in another video. As always, I try to stay factual and somewhat rational when I do these breakdowns. So I hope I was able to give you some good insights and really break down why American food is sometimes pretty bad, meaning why the American food industry is so uniquely deregulated, especially when you compare it to the European food industry. All right, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel.
Smash.
Definitely let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm super excited to see what you think about food in the US and what your opinion is on this. And also, if you have any topic suggestions and things you'd like me to talk about in one of my next videos, also let me know in the comments and just use the word topic so I can search the comments for topic suggestions. And I'm going to see you again very, very soon in my next video. Bye.